As a party, we believe that, this makes a mockery of the public participation process where citizens joined the committees of parliament and the citizens were communicating a very clear message to say land expropriation without compensation. Now, if you read the statement issued by the president today, it's very clear that the expropriation can only happen after no agreement has been reached with the property owner, which means there's no land expropriation without compensation there. What you rather have, the regulations that the president has articulated in this statement, it is to say that if any government entity wants land, they need to negotiate with the property owner, they need to beg with the property owner. Only when there's no remedy or when there's no conclusion, only then do they go to expropriate land without compensation. So that is why, in our view, it makes a mockery of the public participation process, because government needs to do what the people want, not the other way around. You can't have a case whereby citizens go to a public participation process and say land expropriation without compensation, but the government or the president communicates something different.
Yes, and Vuyo, that's exactly what I wanted to say. I mean, we've seen ATM as well as a slew of other parties in parliament have been part of these robust discussions pertaining to this matter. Let's talk about what you as ATM actually proposed in earnest to this particular matter.
Firstly, as a party, we believe that any discussion about land expropriation without compensation must start from the 6th of April when Jan van Riebeeck landed in South Africa, 1652, because now the cutoff date in terms of some of these legislation that have been brought about by the government only starts at 1913, whereas bulk of the land dispossession took place before then. And then the second thing is that land expropriation must be coupled with taking the land to its rightful owners, because we know that Amakhosi were the original owners of the land. So it cannot be that the government wanting to bring about righteousness and correct the evil past, the evil of the past, they will take the land and to the government instead of restoring land to its rightful owners. But in this case that the president has signed today, it is our belief that they could somewhat redeem themselves a bit, because we've got a challenge of student accommodation now, and we've got tons of hijacked buildings in the inner city, whereby if the government were to expropriate all of the lands in the inner city, transform those buildings into student accommodation, that way the students who are heavily in need of accommodation will not suffer for these coming years. So that is how the government could redeem themselves, even though we are not budging as the ATM when we're saying the cutoff date must be changed and also the land must be returned to its rightful owners, no one else.
Mm-hmm. So going forward, Vuyelwethu, what do you plan to do in light of this announcement by the president?
We already have a plan in Parliament to ensure that we put through the proposals that are speaking to the issues that we've highlighted. The land expropriation bill, in our view, that has been signed by the president does not address any of the injustices of the past. That is why we are going to continue advocating in Parliament and putting through proposals in terms of the bills and in terms of how the Constitution can be amended as well to reflect the will of the people as communicated via this public participation process. Also, and to ensure that we do not have a case whereby because the fear now is that the president is signing this simply because he wants to seem as if he's doing something. But practically, what will happen? Will it take another 10 years for a single plot of land to be expropriated? Because sometimes the government does make such actions, but when it comes to the action, whereby there is real tangible changes in terms of the lives of the people, that is not seen. So that is why our role as a party in Parliament will be to advance this cause using the parliamentary processes.
Absolutely, Vuyo, because it says here local, provincial and national authorities will then use this legislation to expropriate land in the public interest for varied reasons that seek, among others, to promote inclusivity as well as access to natural resources. Still very vague at this particular stage. And of course, we are going to give you more reaction from other various political parties. As you know, this was quite a contentious issue that has been debated over and over in Parliament.
These white sensibilities and white fears, this is what has held us back. And the ANC is so terrified of white backlash, and that is why it has given us a Land Expropriation Act which does not expropriate land. This is a serious betrayal of our people. By the way, there were public hearings. The overwhelming majority of our people were very clear, gave the ANC the mandate to expropriate land without compensation. In this act, there's not one sentence that says land expropriation without compensation.
All right. Now, okay, in one of the tweets, or rather X's, I need to get used to calling them X's, right? We are living in a new age. All right. One of your X's says that the irony in this Expropriation Act is that the racist DA minister is correct to claim it doesn't authorize land expropriation without compensation, and the ANC deputy minister is selling us a bad dream, the GNU things, jokes and a farce. We remain landless. So now, given the DA's strong opposition and potential legal challenge to the expropriation bill, now, would you then say there are common areas, or is there common ground between the MKP and the DA on this particular issue?
No, we want land expropriation without compensation. The DA is responding, as I said, like a typical thief. When they see a van of the police, they get hysterical. When you say land expropriation, the DA, AfriForum, and all those who represent land thieves get really hysterical, and they want to go to court. They're jumping up and down because they know that proper land expropriation will take the land they hold illegitimately right now. We must not be concerned about the reactions of land thieves. Really, if we're serious about redress and making sure that historical injustices are addressed, we must simply say the land was taken from black people, and that land must be returned, period. There's no more conversation that must go on. Why must we pay compensation? This is evil, and it is there in the Constitution that when you want your land back, you must pay these people a market-related compensation, and that status quo in terms of the act, of the law, remains. It is not being changed by this Expropriation Act. This Expropriation Act simply outlines a procedure of what must happen when land is expropriated and financial compensation must be paid.
All right. But just to be fair, I mean, with the critical role that you've played in the BFL, as well as all these conversations that you've been having in the Parliamentary Portfolio Committee, what have you done? What has been your role? And why are you only having this? Why are we saying these things only now?
We have been saying this since time immemorial. I have been working with labor tenants, one of the most oppressed people in this country, and they remain landless, they remain abused on farms. It's a shocking situation, by the way. If you go to the experiences of our people up to today on farms, these white farmers are really evil. They even kill them, and the police, they control the police and the criminal justice system in these farmland situations. We have been agitating for land. That is why I'm in MK now, and I believe that we are on the right track as MK to call for proper expropriation of land without compensation, going back right to 1652 to address this question once and for all.
Herman Pretorius here with us in studio from the South African Institute for Race Relations, and Professor Ruth Hall, who's with the Institute for Poverty, Land and Agrarian Studies. Good afternoon to you all, and thank you so much for your time. So, Professor Hall, I'm going to start with you. Some have said that the signing of this bill is a step in the right direction. Your take?
Yes, absolutely. It's high time. In fact, it's 30 years too late. This bill brings our legislation in line with the constitutional settlement that was negotiated in 1995. It says that political transition in South Africa cannot insulate private property. There has to be a law-bound process where the state takes decisive action to restore land to people who've been dispossessed, to acquire land compulsorily, to redistribute it. And this is expropriation. It's not confiscation. There will be checks and balances. There is a court procedure. But I think importantly, there are places where this is desperately needed to overcome spatial apartheid in our cities, to acquire abandoned buildings, to deal with restitution claims that are not being addressed, to subdivide and allocate land to farm workers who are landless. This is what's needed. The question remains, is the government willing to use these powers, and exactly how?
Your institute has actually been calling for Parliament to reject this for quite some time now. And you've just heard what Professor Hall has just said. Your take?
I'm familiar with Professor Hall's work, and one of the things that she constantly gets back to is this idea that this legislation gives legal certainty. It doesn't. The list of grounds under which property can be expropriated without compensation is an open-ended list. So far from giving legal certainty, as Professor Hall has argued in the past, this bill does the opposite. She also makes the point that this bill brings the expropriation legislation in line with the Constitution. Well, not Section 25(2)(b) of the Constitution, because this Act actually requires, or doesn't require, a court order before land is expropriated, contrary to what is stated in Section 25(2)(b). So the legal elements of this bill, questionable at best. Then Professor Hall also makes the point that this is to redistribute land. Well, tell that to someone like David Rakgase, a very good example of the government's efforts to gain land and control of assets, and then simply refuse to give it back to someone who is such a promising and a black farmer like Mr. Rakgase. So there are many, many problems in this bill legally that I think some people skate over. Then there's the unconstitutionality of the process, how we got here. The consultation process in the National Council of Provinces was especially a sham in terms of using a Google form and not proper accepted parliamentary procedures for making submissions. But then there's also just the plain reality that you can't have economic growth and the destruction of property rights at the same time. A healthy economy means people can work hard, earn an income, and buy things they want, and own those things securely. This Act goes against that very principle. So every country that has ever gone down this aggressive route of expropriation in an open-ended way, as this Act does, has ended up in a socio-economically dire state.
Matthew, what does COSATU react to the President assenting this bill?
We welcome it. We've been extensively involved in the drafting of the Expropriation Act. It's now an act, no longer a bill. The act of the country. We've been involved with it for more than a decade. It's been to Parliament twice now. It's been extensively debated at NEDLAC. Huge amounts of public submissions to it. It was adopted in both houses of Parliament by an overwhelming majority of parties, not just the African National Congress. And look, the political premise to it is that we must address our original sin as a country. We can't be proud that we are the most unequal society in the world 30 years into democracy. We can't be complacent about millions of African, coloured, Indian, especially women, people in our cities who don't own land, who have to live in backyards or on formal dwellings. We cannot be happy with people, millions of people, farm workers, labour tenants, people in rural areas, again, overwhelmingly African, coloured women who don't own land in rural areas. And we can continue to ignore these crises. And the consequence will be what we saw in Zimbabwe, which will be an implosion. The devastation to Zimbabwe is what will happen to us if we don't address it. So this is not a magic wand. It's not going to resolve everything. It's not overplay its importance, but it is a useful, it is a sober, it's a constitutional tool to assist government. Because we have seen time and again when governments try to expropriate land and try to negotiate settlements with owners like Mala Mala, it was basically held to extortion, had to spend hundreds of millions of rands on these things. And the state just doesn't have the money. But the bill, the act, doesn't say that it's a Wild West. It doesn't say that government can just run around behaving like some sort of cowboy, taking whatever it wants, not paying money, etc. It's very specific, it's incredibly detailed, and it says Here's a premise for expropriation. It's in line with the Constitution. The government is required to address the legacies of the past, colonialism, apartheid, the inequalities of the past and of today. It is required to ensure people have access to land, to mineral resources, to water and so forth. I think it's a very detailed process how you do it. How must the government engage with the owner? What is the owner's rights, including going to court? Very clear, concise timeframes. How will compensation be determined? Is it full? Is it partial? Is it nil? And when it comes to nil or zero compensation, again, it's quite detailed. It's not a blank check. It says it's state land, because they had an incident, for example, in the city of Cape Town, when the city wanted to charge some years ago an outrageous amount of money to national government for a housing project. So we need to, as the president said, about a third of the land in the country is owned by the state. Should the state really be extorting the state, for example? It says abandoned land, because we've got a lot of land by owners who have disappeared to Australia or wherever they might be. Why should government, and how should government pay for that land? It says if your property has benefited because of a state investment, then the state shouldn't compensate you for that portion. So it's not a reckless blank check. It's sober. It meets the Constitution. And in fact, it's in line with the expropriation laws of many other countries, whether it's the US, whether it's Europe, Brazil. It's not a random comic strip. It's a very sober, pragmatic, common sense law.
As Matthew, they say that it's not a magic wand. It's not going to solve the country's problems all at once, but it's a step in the right direction. But AfriForum is not happy?
Well, I'm very relieved that I'm sharing the room with Mr. Pretorius here, because then at least I'm sharing the room with another person who believes in the constitutional right of private property. When it comes to this bill, it is a direct onslaught against the idea of private property. When it comes to the debate regarding land, the government was serious about the redistribution of land, they would have fixed the restitution process that has been in place for decades now. But that is a restitution process that has been derailed by corruption, mismanagement, and cronyism, where land does not end up in the hands of previously expropriated from people. Land ends up in the hands of those with the right political connections, and that's a story as old as South Africa itself. I mean, every South African knows that story.
Now, in your most recent tweet, you posted, or X rather, Ramaphosa had signed the so-called Expropriation Act, which is basically land expropriation without expropriation of land, and the sky is evil. I shall be breaking down the act to show it's a farce and a sellout project. Anyone who thinks Ramaphosa can expropriate land is lost. I mean, you've gone as far as also calling it a con. Could you walk us through your reasons for this stance?
Indeed, this act is a colossal betrayal of our people. There's no way where it says land expropriation without compensation. There's nothing fundamentally new from the apartheid 1975 Expropriation Act, which basically said where land is being expropriated, market-related compensation must be paid. You know, that's a little bit like saying, if I steal your car and you want it back, you must still pay me, the thief of your car. This is what this act is about. And the problem is not really the act. The problem is in the Constitution. Section 25 of the Constitution protects the property of land thieves, as we call them. And it says if you are going to expropriate, you must pay just an equitable compensation. Now, what that means has been clarified by our courts. Just an equitable compensation is market value. So basically, this act says when we want our land, we must go back, and if the land thief is willing to sell, we can only buy then. So there's nothing new. It is the same old process of willing buyer, willing seller, which benefits land thieves once more.
All right. Now, you mentioned Section 25. The progressive forces opposition parties believe that amending Section 25 of the South African Constitution is the only way to effectively address the historical injustices and inequality that are related to land ownership in the country. Now, how do you perceive the current legal framework outlined in this section?
Well, it is very clear. You know, some people get confused when they read that section when it says certain matters must be taken in consideration when you expropriate, such as the use of the land, how it was acquired, and so on and so forth. But all that is irrelevant. The matter of land compensation has already been determined by our courts. The court has said, by the way, interestingly, Advocate Ncukaitobi, he sits as the judge in the Land Claims Court. He made a ruling there in the MzansiOz case where he wanted to take off some of these categories from the financial compensation. That decision was overturned in the appeal court. The appeal court was very clear. You must pay market-related compensation to farmers when you take the land to redress the injustice of the past. So we are sitting with a problem, and the problem is in Section 25, which simply says land which was stolen from us, now in the hands of white people, if we want it back, we must buy it from them. And it's evil, it is unethical, it is unacceptable, and that is why MK Party is going to bring a private member's bill to amend Section 25 of the Constitution, and we're taking it back to 1652 with the arrival of Jan van Riebeeck and his gang. And because that's the time all our problems started. We can't talk about land without talking about Jan van Riebeeck's arrival. That is the cut-off date, and MK Party is going to bring this matter back to Parliament, and let's see if these political parties are going to serve our people or betray them again.
Now, with that said, Andile, then, as you rightfully put it, would we then not be taking South Africa back to 1952 then in that regard? Because if you look at it, there are significant concerns, and understandably so, that radical land reform could plunge South Africa into great economic disparity. So how do you then propose that we go about this without sinking the entire country into absolute anarchy?
You know, we are talking about redress. How can that be not a good thing? When right now, over 70% of the land is in the hands of a minority. By the way, a large portion of South African black people are without food security as we speak. Farmers in South Africa produce for the market and for profits and for exports. They are not addressing the issues of our people. So only from that point of view, in fact, it would be good enough reason to expropriate this land. But you know, we are responding to the hysteria of land thieves. Look, if I'm a thief and I see the police van coming by, I'm going to react in this way. When you say land expropriation, immediately land thieves jump up and down. They're talking about going to court because they are terrified, because they know they do not have legitimate right over this land. Just say expropriation and you trigger them because the guilty are afraid. And we must not pander to these white sensibilities and white fears.
The EFF says the newly signed Expropriation Act does not go far enough in addressing land reform. Party MP Sam Matiase says the Act in its current form lacks the radical transformation necessary to remedy historical injustices.
Well, the EFF's point is that the type, and this is what we're going to reiterate until it gets understood by many. The type of expropriation from the point of view of the EFF is that in South Africa there should be a decisive disruptive measures taken to disrupt and to reconstruct the fundamental structural tenets of land or property as is embedded in the Constitution. Anything short of this is playing fiddle with the devil. And the EFF will mobilize its structures, its voters, and civil society organizations broadly, and all progressive forces in the country to realize that we need a thoroughgoing amendment of Section 25 with all its various subsections to make it possible, explicitly possible, for the expropriation of land without compensation, and not for the neoliberal interpretation of the ANC and the Communist Party and them that they prefer a nil compensation over no compensation at all. The EFF will continue to agitate for radical departure for the current capitalist neoliberal framework of land ownership.
Expand on this, because now this is the biggest question of all. What alternative proposal do you have to address the issue of land reform? How do we go about it?
It is very simple. You know, white people, when they, after defeating us and taking our land, they went to parliament still. They excluded us, of course. And they made a law in 1913 to take 87% of the land to themselves and gave us 13%. It was an act of parliament that legalized land theft. We have the majority, and this is for me the biggest unfortunate situation. That parliament already, as we speak, is constituted by a black majority. We have the numbers if we're serious about redressing this matter. But of course, white people, from their economic strength, they've bought political parties, and that is why some political parties, even if they claim to be black, they will oppose land expropriation because they speak for land thieves, not the interests of the black majority. But we're going to push it. We're going to make sure we expose those who oppose this project so that our people can see who stands with them and who's against them, and make sure that during the elections, they elect the right people.
All right. When you say you're going to push it, what are MK's plan in light of the expropriation bill? Are you going to take this to court?
No, we're taking it right to parliament because that's where the matter must be resolved. This is a political problem. It's not a legal problem. And so MK Party is going to put a private member's bill calling for land expropriation without compensation in very clear, categorical terms, taking it back to 1652 and saying this land must be returned to our people. This land was stolen from our people. White people who have this land right now have no legitimate right over that land. They are, as we say, as good as land thieves. And we must not pander to their fears. When you have to deal with a thief, you don't listen to their reasoning. You actually go for justice. You make sure they go to jail and the property is returned to its rightful owners. So what is this conversation we're having in this country about a property that belongs to us? We know how this land was taken. We know who stole the land, and they are still keeping it. If you drive here to Cape Town, you'll see all that land. It is stolen property in the hands of a settler minority people.